the story is reflecting something. It's reflecting a change that is happening. It's a story it's a way of handling a change which is happening. And that change is the entrance of the people into politics. So the nation, and the way we're talking about the nation, is a modern form of politics which involves, if not everybody, it's meant to involve the masses. It's not feudalism. It's not the nobility being in charge, right? It's not monarchy. It's not aristocracy. It's not oligarchy. It's not ruled by the few. The nation means rule by the many. It doesn't necessarily mean democracy, but the nation means a form of politics in which the subject of politics is supposed to be the people, right? That's an idea which seems very commonsensical now. I mean, even the people who are against it say that they're for it, as you might have noticed. Basically, everybody in the world, as they do away with democracy, they talk about how, yes, this is the only way to have democracy is to suppress all of these votes and not to let, and for me to, only if I count the votes is a but very rarely do people say, oh, I'm against democracy, right? It's commonsensical, but that's very new, right? The idea that the people are the subject of politics is only a couple hundred years old. So these stories are a way of handling a transformation. They're a way of handling change. Okay, so now I'm moving from what they say about themselves to how they actually work. Okay, the reason that they actually work is that in the 19th century, let's say, more or less, there comes a time when you have to handle a form of politics in which the people now matter. Large numbers of people now matter. And so you need some version of the past which accounts for that. And the version of the past that you can give is the one that says, way back when, the people were in charge, and now the people are going to be in charge again. Or way back when, the people were virtuous, and now they're going to be virtuous again. Once we do away with the empire or the diaspora or one of the things which was in the way of this pattern from happening. So the story is a way of making sense of something, of making sense of a challenge which actually had to be met. And the challenge is, what do you do as the people enter politics? Okay, that's a challenge which was met in all kinds of other ways, like the Marxists, who we're still going to talk about, met the challenge in a certain way. Okay, so the people are entering politics. There is some kind of transformation, and I want you to mark this. We'll get to this part of the course, in a few weeks, but think about what is changing. Is it that there's now a big capitalist economy, and so people are encountering each other in new ways? Is it that there's now a functional state which is able to collect taxes and make people perform military service, right? These are all the changes, these are some of the changes that are associated with modernization. But something is changing so that it no longer seems normal to say that one person, that the king is just in charge, or the nobility is just in charge. Something is changing so that no longer seems plausible, right? There's still kings and queens, right? But they basically serve as the kind of rhetorical cover for welfare states, right? They're not what they used to be, right? I mean, the adventures of, fascinating as they are, the adventures of Harry and Meghan, that's not what royalty used to be like. It used to be. It was always a little like that, but that was never the essence of it, right? So at a certain point, it stops seeming plausible that a few people should be in charge. And how do you handle that? Well, you handle that with a story. Okay, so you have modern politics, and modern politics has to have a story about how the people are coming into politics, why the people should come into politics. And this story is displacing other stories. Okay, here comes question time. What's another story? Like, what kind of story would that have been displacing? What's a story that would have made sense? Yeah.
So like a king is chosen by some religious, like a god, right? Now I'm the king and I control society.
Yeah, okay, so divine right. Yeah. Or, you're the king because, how about this? You're the king because your father was king. I mean, that seems ridiculous, right? Like, just because his father was king, he gets to be king? Doesn't that seem insane? Was your father king? Okay, good. Because I get in trouble if I get into revealing your personal life, right? So if anybody's father is king, I need to know now, or in an email, preferably. All right. So it could be. All right. So, but I mean that notion, right? So his father was king, and his father. It's absurd, doesn't it seem? But In other historical circumstances, it could have made perfect sense, right? It obviously did make perfect sense, but not in modern historical circumstances. It somehow seems not to make sense. But it's a story, right? The story of genealogy, the story that his family is better than other families. Perhaps they have, perhaps they're half gods, something, right? What's another kind of story that this could have displaced? Yeah.
So it'd be related, but just like landowning people or landowning.
Good. Excellent. Excellent. That's a very good example as well. That, but it can be related because the right to property is inherited. I mean, that's something which is still true in our system, right? And it's commonsensical. If Zhenya has a bunch of land, why should, if I have 1 million acres, why shouldn't my children have 1 million acres? It seems almost common. It still seems commonsensical. But the idea that there's a propertied class and the right to own property is something special, right? So you people over here have the right to own property, and the rest of you have the right to work on their property. That seemed plausible for hundreds of years, but at a certain point, around the 19th century, it stopped seeming plausible. But that story, that not just that a person, but that a group is maybe different from another group. Maybe the nobility thinks that it's descended from other people. It often did, right? Or the nobility has earned rights because historically the nobility fought the wars or something. But they're different. They have the right to rule, and they have the right to own land. Yeah. So those are different stories which are displaced by the national story or challenged by the national story, and they represent different kinds of political systems. For example, let's imagine an absolute monarchy, or let's imagine a system that we'll come to, like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where the noble class gets to vote and the noble class gets to own land, but other people don't, right? And at a certain point, that starts to seem problematic. Okay, so we have a story that brings the people to the center of politics, but doesn't say that directly, right? It seems to make all of history make sense. It's a story that brings people to the center. And this is where I have to talk about Marxism, okay? Because it might have occurred to you that this whole, I'm not gonna check you on this, but, and I don't know how many of you know very much about Marxism or how much that comes across your educational. When I ask this in graduate classes, there's the guy who raises his hand or the woman, it's yeah, I grew up in the People's Republic of China and we studied Marxism. So you might have noticed that Marxism also has a three-part story. Marxism also has a story about a golden age and about transformation and about the people coming to the center of politics. In the Marxist story, it used to be that none of us owned any property, and that was fine. And then technology came along, and technology created new social relations, and along with them came private property. Private property alienated us from ourselves, bad. But one day we will get rid of private property, and we will all seize it together, and that will be good again, right? Okay, I'm simplifying this a lot, but there's also a three-part story, interestingly, right? Because Marxism and the modern idea of the nation actually emerged at about the same time, around the middle of the 19th century, and they're very much in dialogue with one another, and they're actually very similar. The difference being, or one difference being, that the Marxist story is about the class. It's about a non-national class, a working class, whereas the national story is about particular nations, right? It's about particularities. Or to put it a different way, the national story, don't hide your phone behind your computer. Don't use electronics at all. The national story pretends to be just about you, but in fact, everybody's national story is very similar, right? The Marxist story is supposed to be about everyone, but in fact, the Marxists had a terrible time getting the various nations to line up, right? Okay, so the two stories are in tension with one another. Does anyone know what the Marxists say about the nation? What the Marxists thought about the nation, especially at the beginning? Or want to take a guess? Or not? Yeah.
Did they think it was going to be a transitional state?
Good, true. They associated the nation with capital, either with feudalism or with capitalism, but not with socialism. So we're going to get over it. Yeah, Jack.
In the political and economic revolution, so the transition to this socialist utopia.
That's in the Soviet Union. Yeah. So the Soviet Union is an attempt to go through all the stages very quickly, And so in the Soviet Union, the idea is that we're going to do we'll do the capitalist style modernization, and with that will come the nation. That's the 1920s. And then in the 1930s, we'll have an economic revolution where maybe we'll get through the nation very quickly that way. Yeah. So the idea that the Marxists have is that the nation is it's associated with a period of history that's passing. And if you, and this is where they have trouble, but if there's capitalism and the capitalism advancing and there's more nationalism, that's a kind of misunderstanding, right? So Marx and Engels had a tremendous problem with actual workers, because actual workers were very often in favor of imperialism, for example, right? They had a tremendous problem with actual workers who were influenced by the national politics, or who it turned out, were as nationally oriented or more nationally oriented than the middle classes or the nobility, right? So nationalism has a tremendous problem, Marxism has a tremendous problem with nationalism. And as a result of this, some of the first people who theorized about the nation in an interesting way were Marxists who were trying to deal with this problem. In around the year 1900, there were several Marxists who said essentially, look, modernization isn't doing away with the national question. On the contrary, modernization is bringing about the nation. And we have to deal with that, right? The nation isn't actually part of the feudal past. It's part of the modern, even the proletarian future. And so this was a Pole, his name was Kellis Kraus, and then he was in dialogue with several people called Austro-Marxists. They made the argument, an interesting argument, that if you have capitalism that uproots people from their local traditions and forces them into a kind of melting pot in the city where the lowest common denominator might be their language, right? And so on the basis of their language and in feeling alienated because they're uprooted, they might seem to think, okay, we're part of a nation. Or they'd be vulnerable to politicians who made that argument. They also said the modernizing state is going to make people literate, right? This is what the modernizing state does. It educates people, it makes people literate. The end of the 19th century, early 20th century in European countries, you go from very low literacy to very, very high rates of literacy very quickly. But literacy can also mean not identifying with an imperial center, but identifying with a nation. Because you're reading perhaps in your own language, or you learn to read in one language, then you learn to read in a different language. And so these guys made this argument, which was then repeated in the 1980s by a number of national theorists, or these kinds of arguments were made in the 1980s by some important and interesting national theorists called Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson, who also said that the nation is not ancient, but it's a result of certain kinds of modernization.